Good evening. This video assumes that you've already read Roe versus Wade. And so in this lecture, I'm going to explicate the case for you and develop some interesting counter-arguments to the legal reasoning we'll encounter in it. So the first thing I'd like to do is just show you the case. So that way we can kind of see the anatomy of the legal reasoning and kind of appreciate what's going on. The case begins with a detailed historical analysis, and it's worth our thinking about because we should be asking why it's there. In the previous lecture, you might recall that one way in which an unenumerated right could be protected by the Constitution would be if the Supreme Court sort of encoded that right, or if they wrote it down, or if they made it part of the constitutional law. But every time you get this judge-made law of that kind, you'll invite a certain kind of skeptical objection. The skeptic says something like, isn't this just a product of the judge's imagination? Is this really attributable to the natural rights that are out there in the world? And to preempt that kind of criticism, one thing, per Justice Goldberg's concurrence in Griswold versus Connecticut, was to show that a certain right is rooted in the nation's history and tradition. And so you might have thought, I wonder if that's what the court's doing here. But there's no explicit verbiage to let us know that this is, in fact, what they're doing. But one thing to think about is, does the court in Roe versus Wade intend for us to think that the practice of abortion is somehow rooted in the nation's history and tradition? If it is, then this historical section is going to be problematic in a number of ways. But if it isn't, if it's not supposed to be rooted in the nation's history and tradition, then we might as well ask what it's doing here, because it isn't relevant to the legal reasoning in any way. It's at most casual reading. In any case, let's read just a bit about the history of abortion. The court draws from four different sources. The first are these ancient attitudes from the Roman era. The second is the Hippocratic Oath. The third is the common law. And the fourth is American law, right? Now, you might have thought that when we're thinking about the nation's history and tradition, it would be kind of weird to think about ancient attitudes, the Hippocratic Oath, and the common law. After all, none of these things are part of the nation's history. They've contributed to it in many ways. Of course, the Romans influenced Western civilization, but it's not like these are distinctly part of American history and tradition, the nation's history and tradition, just in virtue of being Roman. So certainly more work would need to be done. For these reasons, I'm inclined to think that it would be most charitable not to assume that the court is engaged in this historical analysis here. I think it's best to assume that the court is not attempting to show us that abortion itself is rooted in the nation's history and tradition. They've just looked at a few different pockets of historical analysis and talked about them. And that to me doesn't seem directly relevant to what we're talking about today. And so I have no idea why this section is here, but at least it's irrelevant and not illogical. So we might think something like that. So the first section enigmatically begins with a historical analysis, and I'm not sure what to do with any of this information. Remember, on a charitable construal, these things have nothing to do with the nation's history and tradition, and so we shouldn't assume that the court is trying to show that abortion itself is rooted in the nation's history and tradition. I guess it is true in this very last paragraph. They do some historical analysis, but it's very brief, and it certainly seems non-dispositive. So I have no idea what this historical section is doing. Fortunately for our purposes, it's irrelevant, and so we can safely ignore it when we think about the overarching argument of Roe versus Wade. Now, in this third section here, we've seen various arguments that a state might show to curb abortion, to completely prohibit it. One might be related to curbing promiscuity, another might be rationally related to the health and safety of the mother, and a third might be interested in, a state might be interested in preserving and upholding prenatal life. So all these things might be touted as reasons a state might have for prohibiting abortion. And since mothers will obviously have some kind of interest in either sustaining or terminating their pregnancies, these interests must be weighed against those of the state. That's kind of the basic structure of this case here. Now, in section 4, we'll begin actually going into some of the legal reasoning. They'll draw, in other words, from privacy jurisprudence that's been established elsewhere. not only in Griswold versus Connecticut, which we read last class, but also in another case called Eisenstadt versus Baird. The court applies this right of privacy that they've derived from penumbras of the Constitution, and they've used it to do some work in explaining why contraception is permissible among married and non-married couples. And so essentially in section 4, what I think is going on is that the court is telling us, see our work elsewhere, cite ourselves, cite Eisenstadt versus Baird, cite Griswold versus Connecticut. There is a penumbral right of privacy, and we've held it. It can do some work for us here. And then there's a later step that will tell us that abortion is a private matter. And so isn't abortion the kind of thing that could be subsumed under the rubric of the right of privacy? Okay. From then on, we'll look at a weighing of states' interests with abortion, a right to an abortion that stems from a right of privacy. And the court will engage in a kind of complicated weighing of interests. In this section, I find it kind of interesting because one of the reasons that the state might have in prohibiting abortion, according to the court, is that the state has an interest in protecting prenatal life. Now, in their conception of defining what a life is, the Supreme Court tries to make it very arbitrary to decide amongst all these different proposals about when life begins. They cite, for instance, the Jewish faith, which seems to not hold that there is life until live birth. I hadn't heard this prior to this case, so maybe it is the unanimous attitude of the Jewish faith, or the predominant attitude of the Jewish faith, as they say. But I find it a little bit hard to believe, though it's possible. And likewise, some Protestants, a large segment of the Protestant community, believe that life does not begin until birth, according to the Supreme Court here. It's quite odd. They do cite one source in particular that holds that life begins at conception, the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church putatively holds that life begins at conception. And so the state of Texas, in saying that they have an interest in protecting prenatal life, has appealed to a Roman Catholic conception of when life begins. You might think that all this talk about life is somewhat of a red herring and something of a smoking mirror, wouldn't you? There is a sense in which if somebody found a fetus growing from the surface of Mars, you all know what the news headlines would say, right? Life has been found on Mars. But this seems not to really get at the interesting ethical question associated with abortion for me. Plenty of things might be, under some biological classification, alive, but there are ongoing debates about whether it's permissible to end those lives. You see one ethical debate ongoing today with the rise of veganism, right? Some people think that it is immoral and impermissible to cause animal pain, suffering, and death. And they don't do this because animals are alive and other things aren't. After all, vegans eat other living things, at least things that are so classified as living by biologists, like grass and other plants. So the fact that something is alive doesn't have a lot of ethical purchase yet. What we need to know is whether it's permissible to kill something that's alive. As many carnivores would say, right? I mean, those who think it's permissible to eat meat think it sometimes it's permissible to kill something that's alive. And so learning that a fetus is in some sense alive wouldn't really do anything interesting to settle the ethical dilemma with which we're faced. In any case, why are we talking about this? We're talking about it because the state of Texas, if they are to have some sort of interest, a compelling interest in curbing abortion, it would have to be because they have an interest in protecting prenatal life, according to the court here. And so there is this sort of onus to define what life is. But in their attempt to do so, the Supreme Court accuses them of acting in a way that's arbitrary. What I do find a bit odd is after this criticism about the state of Texas arbitrarily picking a point at which life begins, the state then says that there is this concept of viability in which a fetus is viable if it's capable of sustaining itself outside of its mother. And then they say that the point of viability is that point at which the state's compelling interest attaches, which seems to me no less arbitrary than picking one theory of life over another, at least a theory of when life begins. So a very confusing case, very hard to deal with. But what I'd like to do is show you the legal reasoning, I think, that really is underwriting and the court's decision here. Ultimately, in Section 5, what we're left with is this, is the court's ultimate directive. The state may not in any way place a burden on a woman attempting to procure an abortion before the end of the first trimester. After that, in the second trimester, the state may regulate abortion in a way that's rationally related to maternal health. And then in the third trimester, the Supreme Court says that a state may regulate abortion and prohibit it altogether, unless there are some sort of overriding health and safety concern for the mother. Now, this trimester framework, by the way, is one of the first things to go when the issue of abortion is reheard in 1991 in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. A lot of times in common parlance, you'll hear references to the essential holding of Roe, or the need to uphold Roe versus Wade. You might be interested to learn that Roe versus Wade and its reasoning was almost entirely scrapped 18 years later in the case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey, maybe 19 years. In that case, almost all of the legal reasoning that we'll study today was abandoned in favor of another analysis, another justification, in other words, for the constitutional right to an abortion. But this is what we have. We have a historical analysis, a weighing of rights, and ultimately a trimester-based framework at which the state acquires a compelling state interest in completely banning abortion at the point of the third trimester after viability. After the fetus achieves viability, then the state has a compelling state interest in banning abortion, but not before. And so that is basically the structure of what you've read today. And then after Section 5, you might have thought that this is the dissenting opinion, so you would be able to skip it. But I'm actually going to ask you about that in the next writing assignment, so don't zone out just yet. We have Rehnquist's dissent. And I'll come back to this, I think, in due time. For now, the dissent of an argument. You might recall that the Supreme Court is made up usually of 9 members, and that there's a simple majority vote in order to sustain a decision. If a majority of justices side with one kind of reasoning, then that reasoning will become part of the constitutional law. And those who disagree with the majority will oftentimes write reasons why they disagree with the majority. And this is, in essence, what Justice Rehnquist has done here. Okay, so that's the structure of the case. Now I'd like to look at some of the nitty-gritty and particular bits of legal reasoning. So I'm going to stop share of the document itself. I'm going to transition over to my PowerPoint, in which I've tried to do some work in making a nice, clean version of the argument for you that'll let you sort of analyze what's going on. Okay, so here's my argument, or here's my reconstruction of the reasoning in Roe versus Wade. Premise 1, if behavior B is protected by a constitutional right, then in order to completely prohibit behavior of that kind, the state should provide evidence of a compelling interest they have in prohibiting that behavior. Premise 2, abortion is protected by a constitutional right. And so from premise 1 and premise 2, we can derive the following third premise. In order to completely prohibit abortion in particular, the state should provide evidence of a compelling interest they have in completely prohibiting abortion. Premise 4, but the state has no compelling interest that would justify a complete prohibition of abortion. So therefore, the state cannot constitutionally prohibit abortion. Now, if you were to take an argument like this and present it to someone with whom you'd disagree about the issue of abortion, I can tell you right now that 2 premises in particular would arise as among the most controversial. Why don't you take just a second and pause this video and see if you can identify what the controversial premises would be. If someone would be reluctant to accept this legal reasoning, they would either reject it because they think that one of two premises or both of them are false. Which premises would those be? Pause the video and see if you can identify them. Hopefully you really did pause the video. I think that the controversial premises are going to be premises 2 and premises 4. Premise 2 says that abortion is protected by a constitutional right. You've read the Constitution. It doesn't say anything about abortion whatsoever. So how are we going to make an argument that abortion is ultimately protected by a constitutional right of some kind? Likewise, why doesn't the state have a compelling interest that would justify a complete prohibition of abortion? You might be wondering about that. And if you weren't wondering about that, probably somebody you know would drag their feet in accepting this argument, right? So let's posit this hypothetical interlocutor. We're trying to convince them that abortion is constitutionally prohibited and that states don't have an interest in prohibiting it. What might they say as they drag their feet to accept this conclusion? It's worthwhile thinking about. Now, whenever you have a controversial set of premises like this, they will require sub-arguments. So there must be further reasoning involved to justify the argument that you've just proposed, because other premises will be controversial. They won't be readily accepted among others. But I think this is the overarching kind of structure of Roe versus Wade, at least its logical structure. And so let's think about what its virtues are. Well, for one, it seems to be a valid argument, which is a way of saying that if these premises were true, the conclusion would be true as well. But of course, the hard work that we'll have to do as logicians and thinkers is to try to justify these premises, especially the controversial ones. And I see the court is doing this and the rest of Roe versus Wade, at least trying to. So let's think about the justification that's offered for premise 2. Premise 2 says abortion is protected by a constitutional right. Why might that be so? Well, there are a bunch of different ways that something could become a constitutional right. If a practice is rooted in the nation's history and tradition, or is implicit in the concept of ordered liberty, or is implied by a textual right or set of textual rights, then it's a constitutional right. Now, in the case of Griswold versus Connecticut, it's really hard to figure out what the court goes with when they try to justify the idea that privacy and the right to privacy is constitutional. Did they mean that it was rooted in the nation's history and tradition? If so, then they incurred a certain burden of showing us how the right of privacy was rooted in the nation's history and tradition. And they seem not to have done that in the reasoning of that case, if you remember. They don't do any sort of extensive historical analysis about privacy and the practices held dear by the American people, those rooted in the conscience of the nation across decades. There's no sort of talk like that. But it's touted as a possibility for deriving a non-textual constitutional right. Another thing that comes up in a concurring opinion in Griswold versus Connecticut is that a practice might be implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. In other words, when you weigh the interests of the state and the rights of the people, something about that generates a constitutional right. Another possibility, putatively. And then lastly, something might be a textual right or implied by a textual right. And I have no idea what a penumbra is or an emanation of a penumbra. And so I'm at a loss to tell you whether the right of privacy is justified specifically in any of these ways. But what I do know is that the court does think that it was justified by at least one of these ways. And so whichever way it is, that's how you're supposed to be able to derive constitutional rights from the text itself, or because a practice is rooted in the nation's history and tradition, or because it's implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. What is a penumbral right? I'm not exactly sure. Okay, but what we do know so far is that there is this right of privacy. The right of privacy has already been used to do some work in banning these silly contraception bans in Connecticut, right? And so why don't we use the existing right of privacy, which we got one of these ways from the Constitution, and then extend its scope just a bit to include the case of abortion. That's what I see the court is doing here. So, however you got the right of privacy, It was a constitutional right. And abortion is now protected by the right of privacy. Why? Because abortion is a private decision. Look at the text of the case. Abortion is this deeply personal matter to be discussed between a mother and a doctor. It's private. And so, very naturally, the right of privacy extends to it. And so, for all these reasons, abortion is protected by an unenumerated or maybe enumerated right of privacy. Let me just replace here unenumerated, since we don't know that, with a constitutional right. By the way, it's always helpful to identify the students who've used chatbots, because chatbots will take a very hard stand on what the court's reasoning is. Chatbots usually will say, oh, no, it must be implicit in the concept of ordered liberty, or the court in Roe versus Wade said that abortion is rooted in the nation's history and tradition, or it's a textual right. Chatbots always pick one of these, but in reality, I think the reasoning is sort of ambiguous between all of these. So you might be careful for that if you look at illicit sources for your writing. But clearly, again, even in this sub-argument for the idea that abortion is protected by an unenumerated right, we have again something that might be just a bit controversial. Why exactly is abortion protected by the right of privacy? Well, I can develop at least one line of objection to this that draws on previous lectures. You might recall that in Anita Allen's article, she argued that privacy has at least three distinct senses when we look at the constitutional law. There was, of course, this informational sense of privacy in which one is protected. They have a right of restricted access to the information about them that can be shared by others. We saw this arise in the context of the First Amendment and member lists. Something about having a privacy right to member lists of an organization facilitates free exercise of a right to peaceful assembly. Likewise, in the Fourth Amendment, one has a right against unreasonable searches in one's papers and effects. And in the Fifth Amendment, one has a right against self-incrimination. All of these deal with an informational dimension to privacy. Anita Allen then outlined a second sense of privacy, right? She outlined physical privacy, a right of restricted access to one's body or the space around oneself. We saw this right arise in perhaps the Third Amendment, which guaranteed that even in a time of war, quarters may not be troops may not be quartered in one's home. So there's a certain right of privacy to the physical space around one's person. And likewise, again, in the Fourth Amendment, one's guaranteed the right against unreasonable searches and seizures of one's person and house. So both of these senses of the term privacy seem to implicate physical privacy in some way. But there's a third sense of privacy as well. This third sense of privacy involved a kind of decisional privacy, a privacy that guaranteed a certain right to make a decision free of unwanted intrusion and interference from others. Now, one way that this premise 3 and the argument I've developed here might come under attack is if the court means by right to privacy, decisional privacy. Ask yourself that question. And if you don't ask it for yourself now, I'll ask it of you on the next writing assignment. I'm going to ask you whether this argument involves a kind of equivocation. Maybe after this lecture, you can read Roe versus Wade again, and you can see whether the way the court talks about privacy seems like it might be a kind of liberty or a kind of freedom. Why would that be worrying? The worry, again, from the Anita Allen piece was that the Constitution guarantees only physical and informational privacy, but this decisional sense of privacy is nowhere guaranteed by the Constitution itself. It's only privacy so-called. It's sort of a counterfeit, fake kind of privacy. It's not a real privacy. The other real kinds of privacy are guaranteed by the Constitution. Now, one way you could kind of push back against this objection I'm developing, if you're interested in defending the legal reasoning of Roe versus Wade, is to say, No, the court doesn't mean by privacy decisional privacy at all. They mean something more traditional. That would be one way you could go. But at least the dissent seems to think that the way the court uses the term privacy is something altogether different from the way it's been used before. And so there are some, I guess, hurdles to that kind of pushback. In any case, what are we doing? Well, we're looking at this sort of overarching structural argument that's contained in Roe versus Wade. Again, the court is saying that if a behavior is protected rather by a constitutional right, then the state has to demonstrate a compelling interest in order to completely prohibit that practice. And they say that abortion is a practice that's protected by a constitutional right, the constitutional right to privacy, which was explicated and defended and established by Griswold versus Connecticut and by Eisenstadt versus Baird. So then, drawing from these two premises, we have this third connecting premise. In order to completely prohibit abortion, the state has to demonstrate a compelling interest in doing so. But the state doesn't have a compelling interest in doing so. And so, constitutionally, a state may not prohibit abortion. So we then identified premise 2 as being especially controversial. And so we decided to investigate whether there would be a sub-argument for this conclusion. And it seems that there is this right of privacy. How exactly it's a constitutional right is unclear. It might be because it's rooted in the nation's history and tradition. It might be because it's implicit in the concept of ordered liberty, or it's a derivation from a textual right, as it seems to me would be the case, just based on how I'm tracking the metaphor of a penumbra. But however we've gotten there, there is this right to privacy. And then the critical move in Roe versus Wade seems to be extending that right of privacy to abortion itself, which is a private personal matter and which involves a kind of decisional privacy, perhaps. Whether that's a charitable and defensible interpretation, I'll leave it up to you as you think about the writing assignment. Now, again, even though what we're trying to do is develop the controversial premises in a way that will preempt certain objections, we must ask whether abortion is protected by this right of privacy. Now, you might be on Justice Hugo Black's team from the previous dissent in Griswold versus Connecticut, where he thought that just because there were these rights of these contexts in which one enjoyed privacy, one could not generalize to a right of privacy in other contexts, right? That was his basic kind of objection to there being a right of privacy in the first place. You might be on that team, and so you might reject premise 3 because you think there is no constitutional right of privacy at all. You might think the generalization in Griswold versus Connecticut is illicit. But perhaps you just think, as Anita Allen does, that privacy, as used in the constitutional law, has 3 different senses, and that the Constitution only guarantees 2 of them, but that abortion involves a third kind of privacy that's not really derived from the Constitution properly. So those are 2 lines of objections that have been developed against the legal reasoning of Roe versus Wade. And then the next writing assignment, basically what I'll ask you to do is weigh in on those objections to tell me whether you think they're persuasive or not. So keep that in mind as you head toward the next writing assignment. Okay, so now we've looked at the master argument for Roe versus Wade, and we've looked at one of the controversial premises. Let's look at the second one. The second of the controversial premises, of course, if we return to the overarching argument, is that a state has no compelling interest that would justify completely prohibiting abortion. Let's look at why Court in Roe versus Wade holds this to be the case. Here's how I've cashed out their reasoning. If a state had this compelling interest in regulating abortion or even prohibiting it, it would be because of reasons A, B, or C. But it's not because of reason A, which would be prohibiting, regulating, controlling promiscuity and fornication. The state of Texas never made such an argument. It's not because of the idea that an abortion is deleterious to a mother's health, since technological innovations made abortion relatively safe and even decreased the odds of maternal death in the first trimester beyond what they'd normally be. Lastly, it's not because, the court says in Roe versus Wade, because of the state's interest in protecting prenatal life. And so our conclusion is that the state does not have a compelling interest in completely prohibiting abortion. Again, what are we doing? We're drawing from this overarching argument that helped us derive the conclusion that I think is favored by the court. Just delete this. This is a palimpsest of a previous version. The state cannot constitution. Okay. Yes. What we're doing is we're looking at a defense that might be given of this premise, right? Because if you offer this overarching argument to anyone, they'll likely push back by objecting to premise 2 or 4. Premise 4 is supposed to be defensible because we're going to go through all of the possible reasons that might be given for a state having a compelling interest in regulating and prohibiting abortion, and we're supposed to knock them all off one by one systematically. It's this premise right here, even though what we're trying to do is develop a more defensible version of the argument. Premise 4 of the sub-argument for premise 4 is going to be rightly controversial as well. The Supreme Court says that the state of Texas has arbitrarily chosen a conception about when life begins. As though just because there are many different interpretations and beliefs and views about when life begins, the state has chosen so arbitrarily. But then it seems like they've done something equally arbitrary in picking the point of 28 weeks as the point at which a state's compelling interest attaches to an unborn fetus, right? So many objections abound to this kind of reasoning. I'm not asking you to find it fully convincing, but this is supposed to be the way the argument develops in Roe versus Wade. Okay, so basically what I've given you is a lay of the land. If you read Roe versus Wade again now, in light of what I've just told you, I think a lot of the distinct sections will make a lot more sense. And now what I'd like to do as I finish up this lecture is I'd like to return to Roe versus Wade and the text of it and try to show you one interesting feature of the dissent. Again, this is going to be something that comes up with the next writing assignment as I ask you to think about the way Justice Rehnquist's dissent relates to an earlier piece by Anita Allen. Here's what he says. I have difficulty in concluding, as the court does, that the right of quote-unquote privacy is involved in this case. Texas, by the statute here challenged, bars the performance of a medical abortion by a licensed physician on a plaintiff such as Roe. The transaction resulting in an operation such as this is not private in the ordinary usage of that word, nor is the privacy that the court finds here even a distant relative of the freedom from searches and seizures protected by the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. If the court means by the term privacy no more than that the claim of a person to be free from unwanted state regulation of consensual transactions may be a form of liberty protected by the 14th Amendment, there's no doubt that similar claims have been upheld in our earlier decisions on the basis of that liberty. But that liberty is not guaranteed absolutely against deprivation, only against deprivation without due process of law. Now, in the case that we'll read for next week, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, it seems that this dissent really gets under the skin of the court. Because ultimately what the court will do in Planned Parenthood versus Casey is completely abandon the privacy analysis altogether. No longer will the Supreme Court think that abortion is constitutionally protected because of the right of privacy. When we return to our overarching argument for Roe versus Wade, premise 2 said that abortion is protected by a constitutional right. Then we gave a sub-argument trying to establish that claim. Part of that argument involved the idea that abortion was protected by a right of privacy. That's exactly what's going to be abandoned in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. There is what is oftentimes called the essential holding of Roe versus Wade. All that means is that there is in some way a constitutional right to an abortion. Senators, politicians have often been concerned with upholding the central holding of Roe. In other words, the constitutional right to an abortion. But as far as I'm aware, it's relatively more rare to find someone actually committed to the idea that abortion is best justified by an appeal to privacy rights. Seems to be sort of an outmoded way of thinking about what's going on here. In the next case, in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the court will just say that regardless of what you think about privacy, abortion is just a liberty. And since the 14th Amendment guarantees that one may not be deprived of liberty without due process of law, abortion is just one of those liberties enjoyed by American people, and it's not the sort of thing that a state could deprive someone of without this due process. So the analysis will shift. Later, the dialectic will progress when we look at Dobbs versus Jackson. There, the justices will sort of play the skeptical role, and they'll say, how do we know that something is really a liberty that's protected by the Constitution after all? Whenever one announces that something is a liberty protected by the Constitution, one incurs the burden of showing how that practice is rooted in the nation's history and tradition. But if you really do the historical work, this can't be done. Okay, so in the lectures that follow, I intend to not only return back to this historical analysis from Roe versus Wade for further explication, I'll also return to the dissent to look and see how this kind of challenge has evolved to Roe versus Wade. And on the writing assignment itself, I'll basically ask you to reconstruct the argument for abortion that's given from Roe versus Wade, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and then I'll ask you what exactly this dissent is doing and whether it's objecting to the legal reasoning in Roe versus Wade on the grounds that it involves an equivocation of some kind. So that's what lies ahead. I hope you'll stay tuned, and I'm looking forward to lecturing on those when the time comes. Thank